In our culture, men are being targeted into deletion. Women are having their instincts corrupted under the illusion of being rewarded with power. Masculinity and femininity, as modes of ancestral memory, are both far removed from normal ego consciousness. We've addressed this horrid, dangerous state of affairs in our previous two videos, on the terminal lucidity of the masculine and the feminine. Homeostasis is gone, and Darwin has stepped in to speak. It is essential that we understand that biology is superpositioned into psychology. The corruption of collective masculine-feminine dynamics is directly rooted in the self-preservation form of sentience of the collective genome. But for the West at large, this superpositioning continues. Up into the culture, into our politics, and back down again into psychology and biology. There is no disconnect between any of these levels. What is happening right now politically is being directed by the collective genome. And the genome always has a teleology. We can see this Darwinian shit test present everywhere. In relationships, in our schools, in our media, and in the political storm that's just on the verge of bringing us all into the next great war. This show, a dialectic with my mentors Steve and Pauline Richards, depth psychologists with 43 years each of frontline clinical experience, is different in energy and feel to our previous videos. And sincere warning up front, it's very hard hitting. In fact, this is the third attempt we've had at making it. The field kept causing issues, preventing it from being filmed, with all kinds of haywire breaking out. Steve has said to our students that it's as if the words spoken herein are impersonal, and we just had to go ahead and film against the configuration of the field that both forced us to make it and simultaneously tried to stop us. Do not tarry too long before you find the light, as Steve has recently said on our Discord. It's essential that we honestly understand what is manifesting in our culture, but we must not focus on the negatives. We must not collapse into a singularity, but instead turn away before the final moment and change the polarity of the collective field into the positive. Only then can we prevent a terminal lucidity of the West. So I remember you guys saying after last time we tried to do this particular video, things had changed a little bit in terms of the approach you wanted to take. What kind of things have changed?
They've probably changed again because the political situation is such. There was a video this morning that Judge Andrew Napolitano, I don't know if you know him.
Oh, yeah.
Fox guy, he was interviewing a CIA bloke. And I've watched him with Scott Ritter, if you know Scott Ritter, and that's Colonel McGregor.
Yeah.
Don't know his first name.
I think that you sent through a couple of their videos to me before.
Yeah, they're really on the ball analysts, but they've all been independently concluding that America is unraveling, and I don't think that's a conspiracy theory as such, but as America is the anchor stone of the West in terms of its stability, not necessarily its optimal adaptation, but in terms of its stability. And the evidence for this is in the geopolitical situation. Because of what's happening in the Middle East, there's a realignment going on there. The petrodollar is failing. Russia and China and India and China are, antagonistic to one another, but they're aligning with Russia against America and positively towards the Gulf states, including Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are not the best of friends under normal conditions, are cozying up to one another. So America is unraveling rapidly, and it's inclining towards insanity politically, for sure, on the international stage. So that has changed things because we are another step change ahead. It's where we would have predicted and did predict that we would go as the West, but it's the reaction to it is interesting, because that's probably part of the opportunity for change.
I remember you mentioning before that an outline for the video could be that we start at that political level at the top and then we work our way down, essentially, to say that's what's appearing on the surface.
Yeah.
But obviously it's not political what's going on per se, that's just a representation of something else. So would you still want to go down to say that this is all being orchestrated by a genomic field effect?
Yes, because that's where the unconsciousness is. That's where it's operating. And the unfortunate thing is that in the past, all of the prior examples of this kind of thing have been resolved through war. That's the great danger. There are no examples of it being resolved otherwise than through a catastrophic war or series of smaller wars that cumulatively add up to that effect. And there appear to be people who want it to happen. And we've said this before, that all it will take would be for, in a Rupert Sheldrake sense, the behavioral field across the genome for it to decide, yes, let's have this big culling event. And then it'll get out of control. Just like the origin of the First World War should have remained in the Balkans, it should not have spread. And arguably, and this is awful, but arguably, the Western powers should have let Hitler smash himself through Poland against the Soviet Union. If he'd have done that, then the Second World War probably would have gone a completely different way. It would have been just a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. And then if America had handled itself better in the Pacific, then we wouldn't have had the Japanese element within the war. Italy would have been balanced by the fact and restrained by the fact on the Axis side that Britain and France were not involved in the war, but the deterrent factor would have kept them in control. That didn't happen because it accelerated as a negative positive feedback loop into a domino effect of catastrophes. So both the world wars ended up like that. The Napoleonic Wars were similar, which was the proto First World War. We're in a similar event now, or a proto event now. All that has to happen is for the politicians to lose their grip on who and what is motivating them, and it will probably start. There's been enough provocation from one side to the other for this to escalate. It's going all the time, increasing all the time, that provocation.
And the superpositioning effect then would be present, obviously, within the tension leading up to, or the threat really of a war, and they would be present in a war if it came to pass. But then we're also seeing it in the masculine and feminine dynamics that we've spoken about in the last two videos on the channel as well. So the same genomic effect is superpositioned into different areas, and the goal of that is then to drive the overall population down, if I've understood the model correctly on that.
Yeah, the drive it down by number, but there's a Darwinian element to the roll of the dice. And in that sense, then, the competition provided by a war will mean that fitness will be expressed in a certain way. It also involves the movement of population, the destabilization of borders, which leads to genetic mixing because populations are moving around. So all of that will happen. And what we've described in the past as being the collective shit test from the women in the West towards the men will also challenge them. So only those who are most fit in a Darwinian sense are going to resist that. The consequences can be modeled, but I agree with Jung on this, that the best place to look is in the psyche, because then we're really, really close to the expression from the genome itself representationally. So what turns up in the psyche, what turns up in fantasies, in dreams, in mental illness at the subjective individual level, and then how that, as you say, superpositions itself within culture. Because what is within, so too is without, and it's upscaled to the level of culture, but it's also downscaled down into the collective genome as well.
It is worthwhile to pause and explore this concept of the genome driving everything as a form of sentience. Life on Earth is, by the best current estimates, 3.5 billion years old. Human beings are part of this unbroken chain. That is a very long time, from the ego's perspective at least, for the essence of life itself to have successfully maintained homeostasis to stick around. 3.5 billion years. Of course, individual organisms die, but the genome, as a molecular representation of information, is conserved between generations, all the way back to its metaphorical ancestor in the primordial soup. It would not be a stretch to say that the genome is excellent at surviving. It's been built that way through evolutionary pressure. In short, if it can encode for an adaptive phenotype, then that organism is likely to reproduce, and hence the genome survives for another generation. Of course, this is very well known within biology, but, as Steve has pointed out before, many evolutionary biologists are ignorant of the essential role that psychology plays in mediating this genomic struggle for existence. In that gap between observing evolutionary pressure in, say, animals, and the so-called rational function of the human ego, somehow apparently detached from such things, leaves a dangerous blind spot for our collective understanding of human nature. As Steve has said earlier in the video,
the unfortunate thing is that in the past, all of the prior examples of this kind of thing have been resolved through war. That's the great danger. There are no examples of it being resolved otherwise than through a catastrophic war or series of smaller wars that cumulatively add up to that effect.
Wars are de facto Darwinian events. The population of men is culled, and the women have tended to breed with the more dominant force. Infectious diseases, too, are Darwinian events, the other great killer in our history. We have not had a big war or a plague in 2 whole generations. This does not mean that we've broken free of the shackles of nature. In fact, without having had this pressure, we've drifted as a collective further into unconsciousness. Unconsciousness, that is, of human nature. Steve and Pauline's crucial point with this is that the egocentric unconsciousness that currently dominates in the West leaves our culture naive about itself. Just like the human ego, the genome has its own form of sentience. Not rational, phenomenological consciousness, but it is a, quote, complexity of information that is capable of representing itself to itself. This is Steve and Pauline's definition of consciousness. Thus, the genome has its own set of possible teleologies. The one it will choose, speaking metaphorically, will be the one that ensures its own survival. Under conditions of homeostasis, it, the genome, will happily align behind maximising human potential within the population. That's good for the person, and good for it. But as a culture, we are not in homeostasis. We have been disconnected from our instincts, a process which rings the Darwinian alarm within the collective genome, to begin a so-called shit test against its variants, to prevent entropic genetic drift and its own complete destruction. The human ego in its current state of unconsciousness might believe itself to be somehow different and disconnected from instinct, but instinct is always there. The unconsciousness is the danger, as that signals to Darwin to take over.
Yeah, well, we were saying this yesterday, weren't we, Steve? About, and obviously this is just a metaphor to some extent, to do with what's going on, about the 1965 film Jason the Argonauts.
Yeah.
With all the Ray Harryhausen effects in it, and one scene in it is of Zeus and Hera looking down on Jason on a map of the world, and there are other figurines, there are other actors, other players, if you like, on that map as well as Jason. And it's a bit like that with what's happening now, in so much as I guess in the film we're looking up at what we might think of as being, you know, the gods and the goddesses as being archetypal figures. So in that sense, it's a kind of classical Jungian portrayal of the gods and the goddesses. But really the real regulating force, of course, is the genome, as we know, and those figures are just representations of that.
Yeah.
And the manipulation that's going on of people, of populations, of the politicians as well. They're all being attributed to that and moved around like pieces on a chessboard or on pieces on a map of the world,
or a game,
or a
video game,
or a video game.
Similar
Absolutely.
analogs, aren't they?
There are similar analogs. Yeah.
So what we get then with the Greek gods and any polytheistic religion is literally the anthropomorphizing process that emerges from the genome, passes through the level of individual psychology, and then it populates through projection out into the world as deities. So in that literal sense, then in that film, then Zeus, Hera, and the rest of the Olympian gods were anthropomorphized projections of the genome into what we would call a meta-instinctive scenario, i.e. a myth. But the process is exactly the same. And it's happening now. Our gods are different now. They're politicians.
But
more obviously
so. Saying you can look to culture, can't you? To see these dynamics at work, and they're very clearly operating now. And as we've said many times before, none of us are really in control of that process. We have the illusion of control and that we're making decisions, but we're not really. We're all being maneuvered according to some greater plan, which is, as you were saying, to do with culling the population, male and female, both sides of the equation.
It's a fitness test, isn't it? So once the population reaches a size which is too big and therefore resources are scarce, and it's necessary to trim away the less fit members of that population, then everyone will start to go along with that. And they do so through projection and through mythologizing and through generating by internal to external projection representations of that genomic intent that appear to be political or appear to be a pantheon of Greek gods. It's the superpositioning, James, as you were saying, the representation of something which is not in that which is projected, except insofar as it is in resonant harmony with it. And that's where the unconscious element comes in. People are not aware of what's really motivating them at all. Instead, they think, and the politicians themselves think it's them, or they think it's an ideology, just as in the past it was the Greek gods. But the true motivational force is collective, and it starts at a genomic and at a field level. The importance of this cannot be understated.
I think a lot of it too, Steve, is...
In fact, cannot be overstated.
No, it can't. What you were saying before about something that is actually negative being represented as something positive, I think there's a lot in that idea, because I can apply that to say something like the suffrage movement, for example, or the emancipation of women more broadly, in so much as it appears to be in support of women and the betterment of women, but actually it's not. And the idea, for example, that the suffrage movement at the beginning of World War I was strengthened by the war, creates that illusion of women being empowered and, you know, as I say, bettering themselves. But really underneath that, it's not that women are being strengthened, or that suffrage is being strengthened. It's that the process of deletion ultimately is being strengthened, because anything, any kind of ideology or movement which is that radical, and let's be honest, the suffragettes were almost a paramilitary organization in many ways. So there were softer versions of them. There were the suffragists who were more concerned with peaceful process and lobbying governments in that way. But the suffragettes were female and male paramilitaries effectively. And so in that sense, there was a fervor behind what they were doing, almost of a religious intensity. And that's a very dangerous thing, because it radicalizes people. And if you can radicalize women sufficiently, then you will ultimately misdirect their instincts. And anything that causes women to misdirect their instincts is likely to result in self-deletion. And, you know, it's a very dangerous thing.
This is all very familiar.
Yes.
In fact, you could transpose everything that you said onto the present day, including the militancy as well,
yes.
and the exaggerated form of male feminism that allies itself to that destructive catabolic, which is part of this deep structure process which is winding the West down. And as I say, as we have, the three of us have discussed the political situation at the moment. It's creeping up, but it's very, very fast. The pace is quickening. And we did say a few years ago that about now we would reach that point where the first light of a potential change and an antiodromy, as Jung put it, would appear, but simultaneously we would get the worst examples of that catabolic dynamic. So it would not hide itself. Its insanity would be on show at the political level. And for America particularly, because that is the anchor stone for the whole of the West. If America destroys itself, and it seems it's on the way to doing that at all sorts of different levels, that will be it. The EU will collapse in on itself. Britain certainly will. The rest of the Anglosphere will follow as well, and they will have to realign themselves to the new reality. We've got Russia and China, and even India, who under normal conditions is opposed to China. They're coming together to generate a new reality that excludes America and excludes the West. And the American politicians seem to be so gripped in an unconscious fervor of self-destruction that they can't see what's going on. The changes are occurring rapidly in the Middle East as well. The petrodollar it will be finished soon. All of this is going on. And yet the energy going into driving it in that direction from the collective West, as it's been called politically, is not letting up. But there are isolated pockets of awareness of this around the world. This is the opportunity to understand what's going on and to reverse just at that peri moment of that terminal lucidity of the West and to bring about change. But it's not going to be pleasant. It's going to take a lot of courage.
Thank you, guys. There's a lot in there that's very, very interesting for me. And one of the things that stood out, Steve, is when you mentioned about the scarcity of resources, that if resources were or are scarce, this kind of thing might be expected as per Charles Darwin. And I'm wondering if you could clarify on what you mean by resources in this scenario, because something tells me perhaps it's more than just, food and shelter and land, that kind of thing. I'm wondering if the masculine and feminine dynamics come into it too, in terms of mate and relate availability for people, perhaps as a resource, quote unquote, because people are starved on the meaning level, it seems. And maybe it's at that level that these things will then come out in the way that they are. I don't know. I'd be interested if you could clarify on that, though.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned that, because meaning is everything. Meaning is the interpretation that we give. And if it's a shallow meaning, it will appear to be empty and people will be lost. If the meaning is deep enough, then there will be a yearning to put something right. So it's very important for those who want to drive the culture down to misdirect meaning in the way that Pauline was mentioning. But you're absolutely right. We look at what's going on in Holland with respect to the farmers, the supply of food, even what's happening in Ukraine, which is a breadbasket for Europe and for other parts of the world. The whole place is being churned up and destroyed and polluted by military action and potentially by a radiological disaster, or even the use of a nuclear weapon or 10 at one another. It's absolutely insane, but it's being pushed in that direction. And yes, everything that you said would go into that equation as well. And it all incrementally adds up to a field effect. Because the more something is superpositioned, the less conscious people are of what it actually is that they are facing, because it's displaced in its representation in different forms and at different levels. But fundamentally, there is one dynamic at work here. And if people become aware of that, then they can start to pull that representation out from those other levels and start to get control. But if they chase individual examples of this variegated displacement, then it'll take forever and they'll become very fatigued and very tired about that. And then they'll start to enter into despair and defeat and agreement with what's being done to them.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Steve, do you think that some of this too is to do with who is actually the bigger bully at one level? Again, I'm just going back to the suffragettes for a moment, just to maybe clarify that, in so much as I said, you know, they were happy to bomb and set fire to things in order to you know, pursue their political ideology. But at the moment at which there was a bigger threat, in other words, a threat of a world war looming, everything changed at that point, and they scaled back their activities and you know, so some of the less militant organisations carried on behind the scenes, but they particularly scale things back and to all intents and purposes appear to get behind the war effort. But I doubt that would have happened had there not been a bigger bully on the scene. Yeah. And when it comes to power, when it comes to Adler and the you know, the pushing of power, that changes depending on who at any one time, whether it's a group of individuals or you scale it up to governments and nations. That dynamic still plays out to some extent.
It does.
And I think, as you say, now that America's power on the world stage is waning, and we're in a very strange position here in the UK, really, because we've always tended to see ourselves as being allied to America, but we're cut adrift from Europe to some extent because we've withdrawn from the EU, and we're also cut adrift from America. So we're in a very strange situation here, whilst everything else is reconfiguring. But I think there is that underlying dynamic of who we thought was the enemy or the bigger bully isn't necessarily that nation state anymore. There's almost everything to play for.
Yes,
geopolitically.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So if we go back to the suffragettes, and as I know that you hold this view that it was absolutely right that they got suffrage, the means by which they were going about it sometimes was questionable, but it was right that they went about it. But the thing is that they were a small player.
They were
within a very large field.
Yes.
So there's a nested relationship, if you like, of representations of the same catabolic dynamic. So the suffragettes were active, other groups were active around the world, and then the field as a whole generated the First World War. So the suffragettes contributed to the field, even though they were probably unconscious of it, which brought about a mass culling event and a geopolitical reconfiguration, which would affect the genome collectively. If the genome disagreed with it, people would start to feel instinctively, collectively, this is not a good idea. If the genome decides it agrees with it, though, in that way, within its bandwidth of sentience, not human ego consciousness, but its own sentience. If it disagrees with it, then it doesn't happen. If it agrees with it, then it does. So if we scale from the individual personality up to the collective, then we have to take responsibility for consciousness. This was Freud's best contribution, really, I think, to psychology, which was understanding that what we understand to be the ego, the self-referent me, you, as individuals, we have to reality test instinctive pressure against the world. That's our job. That's why we have it. That's why the ego has evolved. If, however, the ego backs down from its responsibilities, then the register for the decision-making shifts collectively towards the genome. And at that point, individuals don't matter. It's the population as a whole that matters in terms of what's best for the genome. And as James has often said, the genome will always find a way to test its own fitness. and a mass culling event or series of events, whether that's military, economical, whether it's a contagion like the Spanish flu of 1918, whatever that might be, or them all occurring at roughly the same time as happened in 1918. Never mind 2019, 101 years later. But we can't talk about that, that coincidence, can we? No, that wouldn't be right. So yes, we have to take individual responsibility for our own consciousness, not be hyper-rational, because that means that we fall into loop cognition, and that means that we're suggestible and influenceable because we're disconnected from our instincts. We have to have a conscious connection with our instincts and therefore our genome. When enough people do that, the field will flip. That's a lesson from history. And it's, again, like what you were saying about Britain. Britain historically, or England certainly, has always wanted to avoid entanglement with Europe. That's why Brexit was inevitable, because that's deep within the collective psyche of British people that we do not trust Europe. Whenever there's been a war in the past 500 years on the European continent, Britain has always sided with the non-dominant, but say number 2 power in Europe, in order to bring down the number 1 power and then even out the threat to itself. It's always done that. That was political and military policy for centuries within Britain. America, whether it likes it or not, is an extension of Britain on another continent, whether it likes it or not. And it pretends it doesn't like it, but it does really. And when it's in that conflict, what you see then is what's happening now with this present administration, that they reject Britain. They would like to see Britain isolated from the EU whilst the EU falls apart. There's something so destructive that's going on. And yet Britain, being a small island nation with a population 1/5 of the US and a similarly contracted economy, is still romantically attached to the idea that America is its own offspring, is its own child, that it followed on from our history, our sense of democracy, and the rest of it. But America will always default, when it's working in a healthy way, to its own interests. Where they are covalent with Britain, that's absolutely fine. But what we're seeing now is America is rejecting Britain, it's rejecting the EU. Something went wrong with that pipeline to Germany, strangely. Things like that are going on. America is destroying itself. Britain has got nowhere to look anymore, except to itself. And what's it doing to itself? We can see that Britain is catabolizing from within, in the same way that it did the last time a gigantic European Union formed and then fell apart in the 5th century, the end of the Western Roman Empire. We predicted this, Paul, in writing just after the year 2000. And we even put it into novels and screenplays that we were writing at that time. It's dated. We predicted this would happen. It's obvious. It doesn't take a great deal of intelligence to work that out. You just simply have to look and see what the trend is.
Well, yeah, we've got all the hedonism, haven't we, for example?
We've got the hedonism
that we had at the end of the Roman Empire.
We've got political correctness, which was in the form of militant Christianity, which was all over the Western Roman Empire at that time. We have mass movements of population. They had a single currency, of course, which is what the EU was after. And then when the Romans began to lose their spirit to maintain their own borders, they began to import people to look after their military defense. And the EU wanted a European army. And if it had gotten it when it wanted it, that would be active now probably in the East against Russia. And we'd have a nuclear war. Well, that's been avoided up until now. Let's see how long we can keep avoiding that. But it's the same thing again, because within the European Union, it's a Tower of Babel. You have different cultures, you have different languages. It wouldn't work. It's obvious it wasn't going to work. NATO has never worked effectively. Not really. If it hadn't have been backed up by the nuclear power of the US, it would have failed on the battlefield. They knew it would fail up against Russia during the Cold War. That's why they had this doctrine of flexible response. They would release tactical nuclear warheads on the battlefield and then strategic. They knew their own military, NATO, could not withstand an onslaught from the Soviet Union. Now we're in a similar situation now, but the lunatics who are in charge are pushing us towards that. But as I say, the European army wouldn't work, and the Roman army worked because everybody spoke Latin. And I know you like that, don't you? She likes all the classical stuff. No, I do. I've got 6% Italian in my DNA. I do incline towards ancient Greece.
You do, yes.
And you've got Greek in yours. That's odd, isn't it? In your DNA. So when the Romans were efficient, they had one government, basically, one form of government, one language, one army, everybody spoke the same language, everything worked well. As soon as they brought in outsiders who spoke different languages, the thing began to collapse. The population then moved into hedonism. We got political correctness in the Roman Empire, and then the West collapsed completely. There is an analog now. This is inescapable. But the capacity to destroy now is on an unimaginable scale compared to then. So we do have to be very, very careful. And the solution is going to be in an individual consciousness, but that will differ between men and women. And that has to be, I think, the topic for a couple more videos, James.
Yes, I think so. You reminded me there, this could be an interesting segue, something we were discussing probably about a week ago. Obviously, we could go back to the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. People will die, nation states will collapse, etc., etc. But human beings are still around. They'll just reconfigure. But as you hinted at, obviously now we have the ability to completely destroy all human life, all mammalian life, all higher life, let's say, so-called, whole kingdoms of it, completely off the face of the planet. And so I was wondering if you guys had any comments on what could be going on there, that perhaps there's something from the genome itself. There's a capacity, not that it is necessarily, of course not, but there's a capacity for it to agree with X amount of all life, all human beings being removed off the planet, if a certain version of itself in lower forms of life is able to survive. Because I found that very interesting. We were talking about that before.
Yeah, I would say, however outlandish that appears to be, it's probably true. There have been periods in Earth's history when we've had mass extinctions. One in particular was as high as 90%, maybe even higher than that. And that was the Permian extinction, the end of the Permian period extinction. Before that, we had a couple of events way back called Snowball Earth, where the entire planet turned into a giant block of ice twice. And the microbial and primitive forms of life were pushed to the edge of extinction on both occasions, but it recovered. So if the genome itself isn't only human, but extends across other forms of life, then there will be a level of representation where that sentience in a field informational sense covers all species. And if a decision is made deep enough and simply enough at a basic level with respect to that field, then why not? Why not reboot the whole system? There's time left to do that and for the planet to recover and start all over again with a different iteration of biology, if that be needed.
So to translate that a little bit, just to see if I understand, it seems then, if that were true, if that came to pass, that that whatever representational level of information that is, perhaps perceives human beings as being stupid enough to be so disconnected from their instincts that you essentially would have entropic genetic drift. So Darwin's not very happy with that, but they're also stupid enough to create the ability to destroy themselves too. Yeah. And if you put those two together, it will go, okay, cool. We might as well use one side of your stupidity to annihilate the other.
Yes.
Kind of the way it sounds to me.
Yes. And when I say, and why not? Let's think about this. If we superposition that dynamic, so it's not in biology, but it's in culture, then we see things like religion or some of the woo-woo ideas about aliens controlling everything. Now we can say, as I just have, that that's woo-woo, but suppose that's a projection into representation within culture. Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument then, that we're not dealing with deities or aliens. We're dealing with the superpositioning of a genome which decides that enough is enough, and then generates representations within culture via the psychology of individuals. And once that achieves a certain critical mass of representation, it becomes collective, a collective representation. But we're not conscious of what it actually means, or that it is inferring about how we can destroy ourselves. So we generate these mythological fantasies. They are mythological and mythopoetic, about aliens or about certain kinds of deities and evil forces that are reified in human form. And even within that, we have the clue that it is humans who are failing in their adaptation. Hence, we have the projection of evil human beings as evil deities or as destructive aliens or whatever. And while we're all preoccupied with that, we're failing to be conscious of where the real danger is. When people like Carl Jung said the danger is in us, it's not sufficient to locate that within our conscious psychology. It's far too limited. It's not even sufficient to locate that within what Jung referred to as being the collective unconscious, because when the average person who grasps Jung's ideas tries to articulate that, they hit this wall of projected collective representation that is mythological. That is not the message. That's an impediment to understanding what's going on. And when Jungians then amplify, as they do, they say, there's that representation, there's that other representation. Each of those is a degree of separation away from the truth of what is actually going on. And they avoid like hell understanding biology. That's the elephants literally in the room that people are missing. That biology is a form of sentient information collectively, and it is capable of doing quite extraordinary things to itself that from a rational perspective appear to be destructive. But if we want the evidence for this, we only have to look at what people do. The more competent a life form is in terms of its intelligence and its technology, the more likely it is to destroy itself and everything else. So from the species-wide sentience level of understanding of what's going on, which is a field, then as soon as one element within that biological field, biological sentience, starts to become too aberrant, it will have to be encouraged to delete itself for the sake of everything else. But people think they're very important. They think they're at the apex of the evolutionary tree. They are, but the tree has roots, the tree has a trunk. The tree also will shed leaves if it needs to. And the human leaves can be shed from the branches of the tree and the tree still survives. We don't understand that it's life itself that wants to continue, and that human life is only one form of it. And if it becomes a problem, then things will emerge from within people to test whether it is sensible enough to stop itself from destroying this world.
Thank you for that, Steve. You reminded me, isn't there a hypothesis? Is it the Drake hypothesis in physics? That might not be the right one, but as to why, essentially, that we haven't found alien life yet because it's so advanced that it's it's just blown itself up and destroyed itself every single time. That's why we've not found it.
A grand filter which any civilization will meet, and when it meets the final one, that will be the one that deletes it. So the final one is relative to any particular level of civilization. But simpler forms of life are far more likely to survive. That there's far less stresses on them. But there is a process, it seems, of evolution that demands that simple forms of life progress through competition and through natural selection to achieve higher levels of resolution. We're on the crest of that wave, but that doesn't mean we're the most important, or even that life as a whole, in other words, the sentience of biology itself, gives a damn about us. We very often don't give a damn about one another or even ourselves. So why should the collective genome have any other view of itself or of us? And the one thing we have is consciousness to make an informed sense of relationship to our instincts and to our genome and to the wider world. But those people who are aware or appear to be to some level of what they call the green movement have been misdirected, in my view, by the intensity of that movement from within themselves instinctively to shift into a Jungian level of pathology. They've inflated it to the point where they actually fall victim So the other two figures in our equation, Adler, power, because it becomes an issue of power. And finally, with a lot of them, the exploitation for gratification of their own instincts. So it fails. They don't have the right way of dealing with this or of understanding it. It has to start at the level of psychology individually, the ego level, and then it has to inform the field widely. And when a certain critical mass has been reached, then we will get a flip. But we must expect resistance to that, and that resistance will increase in intensity the closer we get to that termination point. And we're very close to it now.
If that were to happen, James, and you're probably the right guy to direct this question at, would we go through evolution all over again? Would we literally be starting from scratch in that kind of Darwinian?
You mean life as a whole?
Life as a whole,
yeah.
yes. If it went, to that extent, and we did delete ourselves as such, whatever life was left, would it go through that evolutionary process all over again? Would that cycle just start again?
I think it would have to.
Yeah.
Because evolution is inevitable as long as there's kinetic fluctuations within a system of physics and chemistry that represents itself to itself, as per your guys' definition of consciousness, which really, that's a pseudo homeostatic system. I think it would be, whether or not it would lead to humans again, of course, no one could ever know. But
yeah,
and this is an interesting thing with evolution, isn't it? That I think it's the eye that has independently evolved, and wings have independently evolved several times within the animal kingdom, which is strange. That maybe there's some kind of platonic element there. I do not know, but yeah, I think we would have to. It seems that bacteria and those very, very small forms of life are better at being around for a longer time than human beings are, which just seem to be innately more volatile, which is great for short-term evolutionary change, but not so good when you give them nuclear weapons.
No.
Yes. So I think it would have to. Yeah.
Yeah, we're seeing a massive amplification in misdirected Freudian instincts amongst politicians, which then enters the containing vessel, or it should be, of the Adlerian power drive. That's where it's normally detonated. The energy is contained within that. But the Adlerian element is fragile for them because that's inflating towards a Jungian level of pathology. And that's absolutely catastrophically frightening when that happens, because there's nothing left. There is no cap beyond Jung. If Jungian psychology collectively goes wrong, that is it. That is the absolute end. There's nothing left.
It is worthwhile to pause here and further explore this dynamic of inflation, using words and information Steve and Pauline have spoken on previously. Many of the world's leaders have a personal myth that is based on their own self-gratification. Surely this is not controversial. Politicians often have an obvious hunger for power, Adler, to satiate their need for self-gratification, Freud. To use Steve and Pauline's Freud-Adler-Jung equation, Freud seeks Adler, Adler conceals Freud. So what you see with many politicians is their power drive, Adler, but this conceals its cause, instinct that serves narcissistic gain, Freud. However, with many of the prominent world leaders, this psychopathology has reached the next step, a Jungian level of inflation. In a healthy person, the ego should be the ego, expressing the personality of that individual and adapting to the outside world in a homeostatic manner. In Jungian inflation, however, the boundaries between ego and non-ego consciousness become blurred, and there is an outwards powering of collective, instinctual, so-called archetypal contents into the self-concept, that is, the personal identity of the ego. In the case of the politicians, their insatiable power drive, in conjunction with the collective genomic field, has manifested such a state of inflation. They are unconscious that what they have become are de facto spokesmen of collective Darwinian forces. They have ceased to be individuals and are now superpositioned collective forces. In Germanic myth, this force has been personified as Wotan, or Odin, the Destroyer. Speaking metaphorically, he became manifest in the 20th century, in the inflation of certain political regimes that deliberately sought out the mass destruction of millions of people. Wotan thus being a collective representation of a very biological, very real Darwinian force. Steve and Pauline predicted in 2007 that if Wotan was to return, he would wear a woman's face. By this, they did not mean one single woman, but instead a superpositioned representation of what the biological information the imago of Wotan represents within collective female psychology, made immediately dangerously manifest in some female politicians. A quick analysis of Western geopolitics over the last decade will show that this has certainly come to pass. Insatiable power drive superpositioned into ideological inflation. To put it starkly, many Western politicians are being paced and led from within towards true Jungian psychopathology, with the collective teleology of bringing about Darwinian destruction. To directly quote from Steve, "This is the time of maximum danger. The best weapon we have is a collective consciousness of what is going on. That will drain those politicians at the level which operates through them to sustain them. Due to the Jungian inflation, you cannot reason with them. You have to approach through the level of the field, so that which feeds them is taken from them. Then they will collapse. But you can't meet them at the cognitive level. It's not possible." As Pauline has said, an idea, once it becomes an ideology, is religiose, and then Jungian archetypes appear as their collective representations. That is hugely dangerous. Only biology can ground such a state of inflation. It has reached that absolute level. So, for individual people who might be watching this video, what's the best thing that they can do if perhaps they feel troubled or concerned about this kind of stuff that's going on in the world? Because there's certainly some things that people can do within themselves, I would imagine, no matter how small.
Well, there's plenty of hope because we will get this representation that's occurring now only because the opportunity for a flip in the field collectively is presenting itself, and there are some signs of this occurring. So as I was saying earlier, consciousness is the key, but you have to be conscious, truly conscious. That means you need a proper relationship to instinct, and you need to seek out people who are like you and hold a similar view. This will make the local representation of the positive field increase in its amplitude. Then there will be obviously those people who will not do that. They will choose not to do it, or the decision's been made for them selectively in a Darwinian way, and they will continue to push towards destruction and self-deletion. You may well have to let them do that in whatever way that appears in their life. Thanatos, we've discussed this before on the channel, the drive to be recycled essentially is itself an instinct, and that will ally itself to catabolism nicely, because the more people who delete themselves, the more resources remain. But there is an opportunity now for the fields to change, and we can discuss this, and I think we should, and we've said amongst the three of us that we should do another 3 videos to follow up on this. So we can start with the rebirth of the masculine, the rebirth of the feminine, and then the rebirth of the West, to show how we can tackle this. But it's important to say what it really is like, how bad it really is, and that only consciousness can provide an answer.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, Steve. We have to look at it locally within the context of at a more of a microcosmic level, the macro. So within our relationships to one another, within our families, and we know that, you know, even within, say, the subsystem of a family, that there will be field effects, and it only takes sometimes one person in that system to be destructive in some way, not necessarily even consciously destructive, but unconsciously destructive, and the whole system is affected by that.
Yeah.
I mean, an obvious example would be somebody's in a bad mood, or they have a black mood in the context of a family, and everybody else is dragged down by it.
Yeah.
Or the reverse can be true,
Yeah.
in so much as somebody's very buoyant and optimistic and forward thinking, and then they raise everybody else up, and they have a proper instinctive connection to life in the future.
Yeah.
So, you know, they're just very obvious examples that happen probably to us all in the context of our own lives, and we can regulate those systems ourselves if we're aware of how we might be affecting the system as a whole. And it's an individual responsibility to do that. I mean, that's what it is to be conscious, really. It's to take on that responsibility for the effect that you can, or effects you can have on other people.
Yeah.
And then obviously that scales up accordingly.
It does. So that will then superposition itself, as you say, from the micro to the macro.
It will.
Yeah. But the thing that will really make that happen is that people have to understand instinct. It's the one thing they avoid is understanding that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jung pointed this out. People think they are only, or believe they are only what they know about themselves, and they know next to nothing about what it is to be a human being, because they dwell in the ego. And if that's misdirected, and then the instincts are misdirected, consequential to that, that's not good. Yeah. So consciousness is the key, then relating properly, and then the field effect will start to incrementally grow. But bear in mind that you will see, set against that, absolute insanity all around you at first. You need the courage to hang on in there during these changing times.
So it's a tough topic, isn't it?
It is. It is.
It's heavy.
Yeah.
It's weird, isn't it? Because it's not woo-woo. It's actually real.
It's not woo. No. Like I think I told you guys last time. It's fairly intuitive for me to grasp masculine and feminine dynamics, because they're anthropocentric, let's say, to some degree. When we start talking about the genome doesn't necessarily, it's not guaranteed to care about human beings under all conditions. That's when things do feel, if you're alien, you know, to use the mythopoetic stuff you were mentioning earlier, it does feel like an alien territory. Like
there's a guy we watch on the telly. He walks his dogs, and they're he calls them wolf dogs. They're not really. They're about 5%, 10% wolf at the most. But he's breeding these shepherd dogs, and but he has a really good channel, because he's so in tune with the instincts of his animals. And one of them's called Honey Badger. Yeah. And he keeps saying, Honey Badger just don't care. And Pauline said last night, the genome just don't care. Honey Badger lives by instinct. It does, yeah. And if instinct is satisfied, Honey Badger's happy. And that's what you see.
It is. Yeah.
Honey Badger just don't care.
Yeah.
The genome doesn't care either. Yeah. And if that guy dropped dead, his dog would eat him rather than starve. The genome don't care, it'll eat you.
People will eat one another if they have to.
And the genome will eat the whole bloody species. Eat all of us.
Yeah.
If it has to.
Yeah.
So that kind of effect then must be, because I've got quite a few things going through my head on this clinically, the relevance for clinical stuff. It wouldn't be a good suggestion to give a patient, obviously, something like that, despite that it would be true under certain conditions. So there's a communication persona thing there, which is fine. Is that aspect of the genome not caring under certain conditions? Is that literally just superpositioned into neurosis? Then that's what you see when symptoms are directed at somebody else. That person's genome is like, yeah, I'm agreeing with hurting other people and manipulating other people, and
So thanatos then, when it manifests in an individual, agrees. The ego is also agreeing with thanatos. It's a superpositioning, and then you see that, and that can manifest as suicide, or the descent into a physical illness, anorexia, any of them, because it is like, I'm going to catabolize myself out of this game, and it seems rational, and the instincts don't disagree. It's as if the genome is saying, well, you're misfired. Bye.
Certainly a cure for narcissism, isn't it?
It is a cure. Yeah. Narcissism.
In other words, you don't matter.
Narcissism.
You might think you matter a great deal, but actually we don't.
Is an individual who is drowning basically and is thrashing around trying to marshal their instincts to meet their needs at any cost.
Yeah.
And yet they don't see they're actually embroiled in Thanatos because they're driving themselves towards their own destruction, and it's concealed. And it's that Freud-Adler-Jung equation again. The negative instincts are concealed by their drive for gratification, as if to buy it off. And that then manifests as Adlerian power and manipulation.
All right. So could you, in therapeutic scenario then, when you put someone into hypnosis and you give them positive suggestions and you essentially are communicating with the genome of that person, have you ever had it where the genome would disagree with health?
Yes.
Outside of a Thanatos context?
No.
Okay.
And that's why I have such confidence in it, because homeostasis is everywhere. It's not just biological. All systems self-regulate, otherwise they fall apart. You know, the entropy immediately without homeostasis in any, whether that's cultural, whether it's physical, there has to be that form of persistence of form in a Sheldrakean sense to resist dissipation.
Yeah.
And the only time that's contradicted, in my experience, has been with people who are in the grip of Thanatos to the extent where they agree with it and it agrees with them. And it's usually that the ego has failed and the genome throws the switch, rather than it being the ego is doing its best, you know, and then Thanatos appears. You know, there's something wrong with the ego's adaptation that reaches a certain trigger point that means that this is time to recycle.
Yeah. It does make sense. It makes perfect sense. I'm just curious on that. Yeah. Thank you.
No problem, James. No problem. Well, let's see if it works, I guess.
Let's review it then today. And
then
to add any more whenever would be appropriate, even if tomorrow or.
Yeah, we'd probably have to dress the same, wouldn't we? And
yes, we would. That's okay, isn't it?
Hope the light is the same. You get all of those inconsistencies, don't you?
But you get variations in light during one filming sometimes, don't you? As well?
Yeah. It's a creative process because we don't know what's going to come out, do we?
No.
And,
if anything.
It's a communion.
Yeah. Yes.
It's a communion with the field, and the field says, we will let you say this.
Yeah.
And it's not personal.
No,
it comes from without. And it may just be that somebody has to say it. And then just say, okay, that was something else saying it. And then don't identify, because that's inflation.